Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. On this episode of Victor's Children, I'm joined by Todd Gordon, who, like me, is an editor of the magazine Midnight Sun, to talk about the so-called Freedom Convoy and related issues. Thanks for coming on the show, Todd.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start by talking about the Freedom Convoy, which was, I think, the largest mobilization led by the far right in the Canadian state since the 1930s. What do you think this and the other convoys and protests in other places against vaccine mandates and other pandemic measures, what do these things tell us about the current state of political forces that are more right-wing than the leadership of the federal Conservatives?
I think it tells us a few things. One obvious thing is, and very important, is that they're growing, and I think they're becoming like angrier, if you will. So their street-based presence is growing, and so they're increasingly active. But their activity is not contained to the electoral sphere, even if their energies will be drawn into the electoral sphere, like party formations like the People's Party. But clearly, there are organizers who, as has been well documented, have far-right connections, white supremacist connections, who are seeking to build a movement, an actual movement of the far right on the streets. And I think that's really important to take stock of. I think also that given that there's an important opening that's happened, and we can come back to this, through the pandemic, but this started before the pandemic. And if we think of the perhaps brief or fleeting resurgence of far-right groups in 2015, 2016, 2017 or so, that occurred across the country. Then, of course, there was the sort of Wexit, Yellow Vest movement and the convoy in very early 2019, all before the pandemic. And so the other thing I think we should just highlight is it's not reducible strictly to the pandemic, which is to say that what's driving the resurgence of the far-right that we're seeing today, and the efforts by some to build the street-based movement is shaped or colored by the pandemic, but it's not strictly reducible to the pandemic. The other thing I think I would note is that it's obvious that this is a politically fluid movement. So I'm calling it the far right. I think that includes a continuum of politics that runs from fascists to people who are to the right of, say, mainstream conservatism as embodied in the Conservative Party, but who wouldn't themselves necessarily be fascist, but they certainly harbor and are willing to organize around kind of racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic, or would organize adjacently to people who are racist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic, transphobic, people with those kinds of politics. But in general, I think what you're seeing here as well is a kind of real antipathy towards more sort of socially oriented or solidaristic politics that places human well-being ahead of markets and what these far-right folks would probably think of as sort of their individual freedom. And that would be sort of a solidaristic politics that's often driven from below, people pushing for better public health protocols and protections from COVID-19 that elicits responses from the state. And so I think these far-right forces have a really deep antipathy towards those expressions, again, whether it's from a social movement or from below or from the state, expressions of kind of more socially oriented kinds of public health policies with respect to the pandemic. And they're obviously very deeply distrustful of the government and big pharma, and for good reasons, folks on the left are as well. But it's rooted in that sort of wider antipathy that I'm trying to express here. And so this, to me, is more important than it underlines their kind of openness to the sort of the conspiracism that is out there. That's we often identify with the far right. Like that conspiracism is real. Obviously, there's a lot of misinformation on the internet, but I do think that what sort of provides that kind of opening or a greater purchase for kind of conspiracy-oriented politics is the deeper kind of consciousness that animates these individuals and the groups around them. I think those are some things to highlight at this point. And obviously, as well, this is these movements, as we're seeing them resurge, is very much shaped by the kind of very racist and colonial character that is Canada.
What's your take on why they are stronger now compared to several years ago? Do you want to focus on that? And maybe, I guess, another thought here is that there's, I think, this broader trend in the culture of contemporary capitalism. China Mieville calls it social sadism. And I think it's, we can connect that to what you were saying about the hostility to measures around the pandemic. It's the kind of survival of the fittest, punching down way of thinking that is one way people respond to life in contemporary capitalism.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sort of Malthusian component to the resurgence of the far right that has, I think it has a lot to do with the successes of the right more generally and the ruling class over the last several decades that we call neoliberalism, which is sort of more aggressively reimposing market relations in our lives and weakening alternatives to market existence that we might have found or previous generations might have had through, say, stronger welfare states. And in that context, when people are sort of like market forces are just unleashed in that particular way, and you have greater pressures for your survival through the market and through your experiences as an individual, I think it does bring out or it provides the sort of soil in which this kind of like antisocial Malthusian politics can grow, and people get inured to the suffering of others, and it's much easier to place your own well-being or your right to, as they might understand it, to not be restricted, their freedom, not have your freedoms restricted by the vaccine mandates over the well-being of others whose health is heavily dependent on the proper public health and safety protocols. And so I think that kind of, I don't think we should downplay that. I think that's an important point. Why the resurgence now, what's different than, say, a few years ago? I alluded to the initial kind of iteration of the far right organizing on Canadian streets in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. I guess the first thing to note is that you see the development of the far right or its resurgence in places like the United States, Europe, India, among other places, Latin America as well, earlier. And I think a large reason for that is because it's also important to note that there's a long history of fascist organizing in Canada going back to the 1930s. There were several different fascist groups, some of whom actually grew fairly large in the 1930s, and you see it again in the 1970s and so on in the early 1990s. So it's not like Canada doesn't have that history, it does. So the reason I think the resurgence didn't happen as soon in Canada as it did, or as early in Canada as it did elsewhere, say like the United States and Europe, is the global crisis of 2008 plays a major role in the growth of the far right in these places. The sort of very, very intense economic volatility, the kinds of pressures that obviously working class people face, but also the people who I think are driving the resurgence of the far right, what we might call the middle class, or in Marxist terms, the sort of petty bourgeois, the smaller capitalists, middle management types, white collar professionals, and so on. They face significant pressures in these moments as well. And the depth of the 2008 crisis really brought many of these tensions to the fore. And it provided an opening for far-right folks to get a wider hearing or a wider purchase amongst these layers of folks who would ultimately be drawn to it. And in the Canadian context, the crisis of 2008 was real, but the worst effects of it didn't hit Canada in the way that it did the United States or Europe or elsewhere. And Jeff McCormick and Tom Workman in their book Servant State, and some of the other writings that Jeff McCormick has done for historical materialism, and my own writing with Jeff McCormick in Briarpatch and historical materialism talk about this. And so without going into detail, the early 1990s economic crisis in Canada was much steeper than it was in the United States or Britain. And it destroyed a lot of the least competitive companies. There was a high rate of bankruptcy and unemployment, and it was really powerful in reestablishing capitalist profitability through the 1990s. And what that allowed for was an accumulation of profits into the 2000s, such that when 2008 hit, Canada or Canadian capitalism had more of a buffer. Right? So it remained a bit more stable than in the United States or Europe. However, since 2014, there's been an intensification of economic sluggishness, declining and stagnant profitability, rates of accumulation in the Canadian context. This also has to do with the decline in oil prices in 2014, such that you see now, and this is again, of course, before the pandemic, but you begin to see just before the pandemic and now through the pandemic, really high rates of corporate and household indebtedness, amongst the highest in the world. So there was a lag time, if you will, in terms of like the effects of the global capitalist crisis. And I think that gets reflected in a lag time in terms of the resurgence of the far right. So you don't really begin to see it until 2015, 2016. And even then, I think it's heavily shaped by what's going on in the United States, where Donald Trump enters the Republican primaries. Then, of course, he wins and gets elected president, and he uses his platform in the primaries and as a president to spew his openly racist, anti-immigrant, homophobic, and so on kind of vitriol. And I think, and then you also see the growth of the fascist militias in the United States in the streets. And I think that provides a little bit of an opening in the Canadian context. There's an influence on the Canadian far right, and groups like the Proud Boys, ID Canada, La Mute in Quebec, the Soldiers of Odin begin trying to organize across the country. However, that they're mobilizing outside of Quebec, it doesn't really get more than, I would say, several dozens of people in given rallies. Like in the Canadian context, in the Toronto, where I was doing anti-fascist organizing, I don't think they ever got much more than 100 people at their height. And by 2018 or so, it's largely dissipated, save for the Yellow Vest convoy in 2019. And then what happens, of course, is the pandemic hits, and you begin to see more organizing efforts by the far right. You see them showing up in, say, the Toronto context, the protests around Adamson's Barbecue, small restaurateur who is like publicly flouting public health protocols, and you see protesters showing up, and clearly there's far right people there. And then you see kind of weekly demonstrations and marches in places like Toronto, but you see it elsewhere, of course. You see demonstrations in across the country. That by the summer of 2021, it's clear that they're getting bigger. They're getting bigger. There were this past summer in Toronto marches of in the low thousands, I would say. In places like British Columbia, you have, like in Vancouver, and even in smaller towns, you have protests against this pandemic, against the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates in the thousands. And so it's been building. I think that's important to recognize. And so the pandemic is the sort of is the opening that these folks are taking, and they're organizing around these particular issues. But again, just to stress the point, this is a phenomena that begins pre-pandemic, but it's really the pandemic is giving them a really big boost. So the convoy doesn't really come out of nowhere. I think it's important to recognize that. It's been building for the last couple of years.
Okay, let's focus on the kinds of politics that we're talking about a little bit, because I do think it's useful to distinguish between those forces on the right that still accept the framework of capitalist democracy with elections and so on, but they really want to roll back the rights of workers and oppressed people within that framework, to gut public services, to make vaccination and mask wearing optional at best, and so on. And then people further to the right who actually would aim to ultimately dismantle capitalist democracy altogether. Although, of course, these shade into each other. There's no moat that divides the one from the other. So, thinking about it in those terms, what do you say about the politics that we're seeing around these mobilizations, and also around things like the People's Party?
Right. Yeah. I think, again, I used the word fluid earlier, and I think that's true. I think these things are fluid, though I also think the more far right sort of politics has a gravitational pull on these movements. So that there might be people of a different sort of political backgrounds that show up to these demonstrations, some more far right, more deeply committed and more ideologically coherent than others. I think if these movements continue, you're going to see a sort of a rightward shift to them. But in terms of your question, like how do we understand the difference between the different poles on the right, I tend to distinguish between a more mainstream conservatism that in the Canadian context, say we would identify with the Conservative Party, and a broader far right that would include fascists, as well as, and for whom fascists key to their politics or organizing on the street, to being able to dominate the streets and having a strong presence on the streets to assert their politics. Even if they participate in elections are not key to, don't come or aren't prioritized over sort of street-based mobilizations. So on the far right of that, I would include fascists, but I think it also includes people who are to the right of the Conservative Party, who are more assertive and committed to their racist politics, their class domination, anti-ecological politics as well, but who might not necessarily be as committed to building street-based fighting forces like fascists are, and may not necessarily be as committed as fascists are to completely doing away with electoral democracy. Although I would think a lot of far-right conservatives wouldn't be as committed to electoral democracy as, say, mainstream conservatives, if you will. So not to confuse, I think there's a continuum within the far right, and there's a continuum between far right and mainstream conservatism. And as you say, they can sort of bleed into one another. And so just to give an example of that, if you think historically in Canada, the mainstream conservative parties have often had connections of one form or another with fascists, and fascists have sought to organize within mainstream conservative parties. So for example, in the 1930s, the largest fascist organizations were in Quebec, and one of their key leader, Adrien Arcon, was actually financed by the Conservative Party to help organize the Conservatives electorally in the province. And they sought to use his organizational infrastructure to build support for the Conservative Party. And that was done over 2 elections. And there was a supporter of Arcon who was in the Bennett government. If you look at the history of the Social Credit Party, for example, in Ontario and Alberta, you could find from the 1930s into the 1970s white supremacists in the Social Credit Party, or the formation of the Reform Party, who in their earliest iteration, the late 80s, early 90s, I would say, would be more on the far right than mainstream conservatism. But they also had ties to, or they had fascists who were in their organization, and the Heritage Front, a neo-Nazi group in Ontario, provided security for them in their riding association meetings in 1991 in Toronto, and at a large rally in Mississauga that drew about 6,000 people. There is a lot of overlap there. I do think it's important to distinguish fascism specifically because of how central violence and street-based organizing and the absolute destruction of electoral democracy is to them. And so it's important to distinguish that between the rest of, obviously between mainstream conservatism, but also between far right, who maybe isn't quite fascist. But I think it's also, again, just to stress the point, if the far right continues to grow, I think you're going to see more people drawn towards the fascist wing of it.
And then there's the question of the broader sympathy or the broader resonance that the protests have had, far beyond the people that actually have shown up for the protests. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I guess the first thing I would just say is my reading of polls suggests that the overwhelming majority of Canadians are still quite sympathetic to various aspects of to vaccine mandates, to if not full lockdowns, but certainly like making sure that various kinds of public institutions and businesses are safe for people to be in. And so most people, my reading of it is actually aren't sympathetic to the convoy. I think that's important to remember. It's relatively small in terms of what it draws in. But I think that there's a lot of people who have been hurt by the pandemic, and especially, not exclusively, but especially small business folks who play a central role in the far right and in the convoy in particular. And their answer to this is this kind of organizing. And so small business owners, I think, are right now in a very precarious situation. Rising business indebtedness affects them in a way that they don't have the kinds of resources and capacities to survive in times of crisis that a lot of big multinational corporations do. They don't have access in the same way to transnational supply chains. They don't have access to foreign markets. And they don't have access to the government in the same way. A thing like a lockdown or vaccine mandate can, for a lot of these kinds of folks, take on it can, in their mind, be a real threat to their existence. And I think we that's important to recognize as something that's driving them. In terms of a wider layer of perhaps a libertarian sentiment that might exist out there, I think, as you mentioned earlier, that it part of that is the decades of neoliberalism and the way that has just sort of inured people to the sufferings of others. I think that's an important part of it as well.
And then, looking forward, do you have any thoughts about the future prospects beyond what you've already said, and particularly around what may happen with the capitalist crisis and the trajectory of the economy and how that may play out around the politics of the right?
Well, I think so. First, I think some of the economic uncertainty that's been produced by the pandemic. You think of inflation. For one, the increased indebtedness for businesses and their precarity. The pandemic, even if the pandemic ends sometime in the not too distant future, I think the after effects of it could be felt for a while longer. But as I've stressed, the economic crisis isn't reducible to the pandemic. Canada was heading towards, and Jeff McCormick and I have tried to sort of argue that or demonstrate why this is in our article on Briarpatch and historical materialism. Canada was in a difficult situation. Canadian capitalism was in a difficult situation preceding the pandemic, and the pandemic hasn't corrected that. And of course it wasn't going to. And so I think that there is a real possibility of a deepening crisis of capitalist accumulation in Canada over the next few years. I don't think it's going to be avoidable. How deep it is, the scale of it, obviously I don't know. But a lot of the indicators, low levels of profitability, low levels of accumulation, increasing indebtedness, suggest that it could be quite serious and significant. And so given that the far right, including fascists, tend to prosper in periods of crisis, particularly periods of sustained crisis, I think we'd be foolish to think that this is going to go away with the end of the pandemic. Given, as I already stressed, internationally, the resurgence of the far right started long before the pandemic. And even in Canada, even if it started later, it started before the pandemic, even if it waned in 2018, 2019. So this isn't simply about the pandemic, and should be prepared for it to continue and possibly to grow. We've seen the People's Party's support electorally grow from, I think it was 1.5% or so to 5% over 2 years. And the pandemic obviously played a role in that, but the People's Party started before the pandemic as well. And another, I think, important factor is what are we on the left able to do in response to this? Because that's also a variable here. Far-right forces are able to grow in contexts where they're not being challenged. And as we can see in Ottawa, the police are not going, and the state is probably not going to take on or be committed to challenging the growth of the far right. And nor, I think, do we want to try to embolden the state and the police to do so, because their power is usually turned on the left more than it is on the right. So I think the ability of the left to think seriously about what's happening, make sense of it, and to mobilize on that basis is going to be crucial in terms of how what happens with the trajectory of the far right.
I think it's worth mentioning here, there was an article recently written by Judy, Rebick, and Corvin Russell. It was published on rabble.ca that made the point about how absent the left has been in terms of the broader politics of the pandemic and how that's created openings for the right in the context of the pandemic, that I just wanted to mention in case listeners haven't heard that or haven't read it, sorry. Maybe this the last thing we could talk about then is about what can be done, what we can do to try to limit the growth of the right and to try to weaken it, which is obviously a challenge given the very weak, fragmented, and mostly unorganized state of the radical left in the broad sense in the society. Any thoughts?
Well, there are no easy solutions. We have to acknowledge that, as the article you just mentioned does, that the left is not in, and particularly the social movement left, but also the electoral left, is not in a good position right now, and it hasn't been for some time. And so I don't want to sound like overly formalistic or pat in saying that we need to rebuild our forces, because it's true, we do. And I think that is not something that's not simply about our ability to respond to and challenge the strength in the streets of the far right, although obviously we're going to need to do that if it continues to grow. But in general, I think we're seeing this I think there's some important exceptions, but weakness in general in social movements and unions. And I think the left needs to be thinking not just about rebuilding our forces against the far right, but about rebuilding our forces, period. And within that context, trying to build some kind of campaign that will direct some of our political energies towards challenging the far right. And I was at a demonstration yesterday, a counter protest in Toronto that was organized by healthcare workers, and I'm so happy that they did that. But there was maybe 200 people out, and there was a few thousand at least of the far right that was meeting. And so I say that because there is a tendency on people in the far left to fetishize confrontation and deplatforming. And while I think we ultimately need to confront and challenge the street-based power of the far right, we have to build our capacities to do so. It's very clear to me that small, what sometimes is called squadism, small groups of people who have not done any kind of thinking about or made any effort to organize beyond themselves, fetishize their small groups confronting the far right. And in the 2015 to 2018 or so, I think that was a dominant feature within anti-fascist organizing, certainly in Toronto, where I was involved. And it was only because the far right wasn't able to grow, the window that opened for them closed fairly quickly, and they weren't able to grow in any significant way. It was because of that we were able to sort of somewhat successfully challenge them when they did try to organize in Toronto. But it was always very clear to me that if they had grown, for whatever reason, if they had tripled or quadrupled in size, we were in no place to challenge them. And there was not a lot of interest amongst a lot of the activists who were involved in the organizing, in the anti-fascist organizing, to actually think about how we could reach beyond our fairly small and narrow, politically narrow circles to try to build wider layers of a campaign based on wider layers of people. And now there's thousands of them in the street. We simply don't have the capacity to go out and safely challenge them. And so that has to be front and center, is rebuilding our forces more generally, and then drawing some of that energy into anti-fascist organizing. And I think that's going to have to be building up community-based organizing and the absolute importance of trying to rebuild unions, which have mass memberships, and could be really important sites for organizing. And there's a potential power there that just hasn't been tapped into in the last few years, with perhaps a few very small exceptions.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think both about the things that we do to directly take on the right and things that make it more difficult for them by changing the terrain. So that militant workplace and community organizing, which gives people a way to act collectively to defend their situations and try to make things better, provides an alternative to scapegoating and to the kinds of appeal that the far right has. And the same, we could also think about the ideological fight against the politics that animate the far right, whether that be, the far right's anti-Indigenous, pro-settler colonial ideas. And maybe just as an aside, I think the very public, questioning and criticisms of Canada that have come up in recent years because of Indigenous struggle and so on. This is, I think, one of the things that infuriates elements which then are in the far right. But
yeah, I'll just quickly, David, I'll add, like, the climate change organizing, I think is a very important example of that, where there was for a moment, there was we were able to put tens of thousands of people in the streets and in solidarity with Indigenous peoples engaged in blockades that, in 2019, 2020, just before the pandemic. And the far right, generally speaking, ranges from climate change deniers to, just pro fossil fuels. And so I think there's important connection there as well. And your point is well taken. Our ability to organize also shapes our ability ideologically to kind of shift the political narrative that is out there, and to rebuild both materially and ideologically better bonds of solidarity.
Right. So yeah, whether it's around anti-colonial politics, anti-racist politics, just feminism, queer and trans politics, various kinds of ways that we can take on the ideas that the right thrives on, particularly when we can break out of the spaces where those kind of politics have more influence today into places where they don't or have as much. And I think that's an important thing to think about. And as well, I think there's ways where we can try to take on, then specifically their organizing efforts. But as you say, that takes the ability to actually mobilize in significant numbers. Although I think this was a point you haven't made in this discussion, but I've heard you make it before, that we have to recognize that these recent mobilizations were far right led, but they weren't made up of thousands of coherent far right people, right? And so there's a range of different kinds of people that are involved, but there are times when we can take on their ideologues, the Jordan Petersons of the world, and take on their organizing when they try to actually organize in person, providing that we have the forces to do that. So I just think it is helpful to think about it in kind of two strands: the things that we can do to affect the society that makes it more difficult for the right, and then the things we can do to directly tackle them. They need to be done together, I think, as you've been saying, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that without that kind of organizing, we're going to be in trouble. But as you say, not everyone who's at these protests is necessarily a dyed-in-the-wool member of the far right. They're not. But the thing is, they're being mobilized by the far right, and they're offering an audience to the far right. And so I do think that kind of political shift, that political pull, is real. But yeah, at present, it's not 5,000 or whatever, 10,000 people in Ottawa on the streets who are all far right and certainly not fascist. But nevertheless, we have our work cut out for us, because like what we're talking about here is a significant resurgence of the left beyond the spaces that I think it's become fairly comfortable in, at least certain parts of the left, and sort of re-engaging our ability to connect to wider layers of people who are not happy with the way the world is working, but aren't happy with what the sort of far right, the alternatives those far right organizers are posing. And so part of that, I think, is like also rebuilding people's sense of possibility.
And that connects, I think, quite nicely to the next segment coming up on this episode of Victor's Children about workplace organizing in Canada Post in Edmonton. So thanks, Todd.
Thank you very much for having me.
Roland Schmidt, welcome to Victor's Children.
Thank you, David. Always a pleasure.
Could you introduce yourself to listeners?
My name is Roland Schmidt. I've been a member of Canadian Union of Postal Workers at the Edmonton local for close to 20 years now. Most of those years were spent as a shop steward and work floor activist. And most recently, over the past 3 years, I was just re-elected as the local president.
So you've been working almost for 20 years at Canada Post. Did you have any unionized jobs before that, or did you just start there?
Nothing major where I was involved. I did have a few kind of odd jobs that did have a union presence, but I wasn't there long enough to really establish myself, such as at one call center for Statistics Canada. It was, I believe, was represented by the Public Servants Alliance of Canada, but I was only there for a summer. So,
and when you started at Canada Post, looking back, what would you say your politics were?
I deliberately went into Canada Post to be involved with CUPW. I became disenfranchised, I guess, with the world as it is at a pretty young age in my late high school years and early university years. And I identified that, rightly or wrongly, I figured that the labor movements are best shot of creating a more equitable society that, takes care of the vulnerable, but also finds ways to maximize human potential. And I figured that the labor movement's the best vehicle to achieve that, because it's always a question of power. And in the context of Canada, CUPW has a pretty exemplary history of radical work floor activism. So, I'd read a lot about it, kind of followed up in university a little bit on the history of unions in Canada, and CUPW always seemed to jump out. And so I had the idea of I want to be a part of this. So I joined Canada Post, specifically to become a CUPW member. And as soon as I cleared probation, I got on board with my first shop steward course. And so I guess the rest is history. But as far as my politics, I would say broadly, I've always sort of believed in workers' democracy. And then, along the years, it's just different terminology comes up, whether it's democratic socialist, empowering workers advocate. I'm not too attached to any of the particular terms. It's just more about getting the work done on the job site.
And when you got the job, did you go in by yourself?
Yes. Yeah. So I did have other people I'd, had relationships with in the political community in Edmonton, but things didn't kind of line up for other people to seek jobs at the post office.
So when you started working at Canada Post in Edmonton, what was the workplace like in terms of workers' power in the workplace?
Well, it was a pretty rude awakening, right? It's like you read about these struggles from the 70s and 80s, and especially the fight for CUPW to win maternity leave. I just thought that was just such a beautiful thing to achieve, and that how that benefited not only our union but really all of Canada, and the kind of power that was. The capacity that was built around that to be successful. And then you just sort of figure that culture is entrenched in the union. And then when I joined in the early to mid 2000s is when I started at Canada Post. It was in the local at the time, it was anything but that. It wasn't like people were against the idea of an empowered union doing work floor activism. It was just more that the leadership at the time didn't have a strong sense of how to create that. And they were more sort of bogged down in the administrative aspects of the union. So I got involved. I was really excited. Like I threw myself at any opportunity I could, whether it was like the organizing committee, like the newsletter committee, shop steward work. And they were very excited to have me because it's rare for young people that knew about union politics joining the union and wanting to be involved right away would seek them out. And so they couldn't throw opportunities at me fast enough. And it became this kind of awkward situation of they wanted to give me opportunities, but I had my own ideas of how the union should be behaving. And they didn't, some people felt threatened by that. It's not so much that they were against the ideas, they were just threatened by someone else kind of being like, hey, how about we do it this way? And there was definitely a little bit of rubbing up against as we call it, gatekeeping. So it's like, entrenched leadership bodies being very reluctant to share that influence.
Does anything stand out to you when you think back about what the workplace was like in the early years when you started, in terms of how management treated people and to what extent workers actually pushed back?
They're like management's always been the same. It's just like they take advantage where they can. So if you have a workstation that doesn't have, say, a strong shop steward presence, then you're going to have these little petty violations of the collective agreement. And that was definitely the case back then. But the only pushback that existed was maybe a steward trying to go into the office and lecture them about the collective agreement and threaten to file a grievance. And to which Canada Post, in most times, they don't care. It's like, okay, fine, file the grievance. We'll see you at first level to discuss this. We'll dismiss it, and then we'll let arbitration deal with it, 8 to 16 months down the road. And I always sort of cynically refer to this as the formula. It's like when Canada Post makes a decision, or I would say when most unionized companies make the decision to knowingly violate the collective agreement, they've made the choice that the violation will be what they gain in violating far exceeds the penalty that they'll have to face. And I think that's a larger question that we're going to come back to in our conversation today.
Yeah, and certainly the backlog of grievances at Canada Post is pretty infamous. It's
oh yeah, thousands. And it's like, we have some that are dating back more than 10 years, right? So it's absurd, and they know what they're doing, and the union hasn't sort of figured out that they need to change the way they approach this problem.
So you said you came up against some gatekeeping.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about what kind of things you thought should be done, what kind of change was needed in the local?
Yeah, so for me, it was like getting involved in the union and then identifying pretty quickly that they didn't have a pipeline to empower work floors. And by that, I mean, it's any skill set doesn't happen spontaneously. Like if you want someone to be good at grievances, you train them in how to do that. If you want someone to be good at running an educational course, you train them on how to do that. If you want someone to be a good work floor activist, you have to put in the resources and actually have people come out and learn how to do that. So they did not have a pipeline to encourage that kind of activity. So very early on, I tried to encourage the education apparatus of the local to run courses that would allow newer members, not just like the true believers and the people that are always like the same 25 people that would come out to a GMM. It's like we would want to extend it and try and inspire people that had never come out to a meeting, and to try and explain that unions are not just about calling an office, it's about building collective power. And here are the tools to do that. So, I received a lot of pushback on those sort of ideas, because it would just be like, well, why should we spend money on people that don't come out to meetings? And it's just like, you can't blame, like, the members could be difficult sometimes, but you can never blame your audience. You can never blame your membership. It's contingent on us as a leadership group to inspire people to get involved. And those ideas weren't received well. And especially if you have an executive that is majority composed of people that aren't hospitable to, say, work floor organizing, it's like they're not going to reallocate the resources to allow that to happen. So then what ends up happening is I kind of maybe distance myself from trying to do things in like the formal way, like took my medicine and understanding that CUPW wasn't was no longer the legacy. It no longer represented the legacy that it used to. And just tried to find allies outside of those like formal structures. which eventually led to a pretty monumental campaign for our local in 2011, where we had a citywide refusal of forced overtime.
So can you talk about the Taking Back the Work Floor course?
Yeah, sure. So I just alluded to the 2011 forced overtime refusal. So that was kind of like a perfect encapsulation of the collective agreement at the time said that the company was allowed to force letter carriers to work overtime if it meant covering routes that were down for whatever reason. So we would hit every winter would be a situation of injuries would pile up, or people would be sick, or people would be off on holidays. And the combination of the things, we would be short staffed. So you would finish your mail route, and then they would say, oh, it's your turn. You have to take out like a portion of another route after you're done your route. And people, like in the winter, they'd be like, okay, it's around the holidays, I could use a little bit of overtime. But when this became a matter of like 2 or 3 times a week, you would be forced to do extra work. It really deteriorates morale, and people start getting quite angry. And the company would just rightfully say, oh, the collective agreement, this is, we're within our right to do this to you. And then people would like reach out to the union office, and the union would just say, well, the collective agreement says that we can't grieve it. So what can we do? And there was a group of us at the time, maybe a handful, 4 or 5, spread out between different stations that were just like, doesn't matter what the collective agreement says. If the workers don't like it, we should do something about it. And there was a couple of stations where we started holding work floor meetings. So example, in my old station, we would bring everyone down to the lunchroom and talk about our frustrations involving the issue. And actually we actually have some video. Someone took video of it that we ended up implementing into the course. But we would have a meeting, talk about our frustrations, and then we'd come back upstairs and demand a meeting with management. And we would just say, look, we need more staff. It started typically a very Canadian politeness. It would just be like, hey, look, our feelings are hurt. We're concerned. Do you realize our feelings are hurt? What are you doing about it? Can you look into this for us? And it was, for my part, I helped frame it that way because that's where people were at. It was just like the workers really felt that management just didn't understand. So it's like, okay, we'll give management the opportunity to disappoint us. So they would come back the next week. We would follow up with another work floor meeting. Management would just be like, yeah, sorry, nothing we could do about it. And then that's when the switch came of like, oh, okay, this is an adversarial relationship. We aren't on the same team. And we started having representatives from different stations meeting and coordinating. And it culminated with like issuing of demands of like, we want staffing promises. And by this date, we want new people being brought in. We want forced overtime being done by this date. And if not, we're refusing it. And eventually it did result in a few stations just putting down the hard line of like, we are refusing. Management going around to people at their cases, like a group of management, like 3 people coming up to a worker and saying, with a clipboard being like, you are in line for doing forced overtime today. Are you taking forced overtime? And then the worker being like, no, I don't feel comfortable. And the management being like, are you disobeying a direct order to take forced overtime? And then like a group of workers all around, like supporting that person, the person being like, I'm not doing it. And then everyone just, kind of jeering a bit, and then management going back to their office. And we're just, then they would have the disciplinary meeting for that worker. And typically after a disciplinary meeting, there's a summary letter issued saying like what the punishment is. So one of those meetings happened. We had a work floor meeting with management. We said that if you discipline this worker, there will be escalation. And they just didn't discipline. And that broke Canada Post at that point. People just stopped doing forced overtime. And they eventually, like within a month or so, they brought on new people because it does take time to train new workers. And interestingly enough, in our last collective agreement talks, Canada Post was very conciliatory about removing the forced overtime clause in the collective agreement. They, as far as I understand, they went as far as almost like volunteering that clause. So I'm not sure if that was partly inspired by the 2011 struggle. But it is an interesting development because it created a real political vulnerability for the company. Now, back to your question about the course, all of that organizing was mostly done like people like myself, other activists who are just, this is their first time, right? like myself, I'd read a lot about these things, but I'd never formally be involved in anything like that. So I had some like theoretical ideas, but a lot of the people we were involved with, really, this was their first go at it. So I'm very proud of the work we did, but clearly we made some mistakes along the way. And what we did coming out of that is we tasked a group of people to kind of take the video of those encounters, take like the written statements and demands, and put it into like a package of like how to do successful workflow organizing. So it walks through of like, here's how you build a group of people in your workplace, and how to engage other workers on an issue. Here's how to have a workflow meeting. It's really, really pressing role play. And I think that's an important component. Like, so we have 30 people in a room. We have 3 people acting as management. We have them be very aggressive as managers to like push back on the other 20. And the 20, to like get through that part of the course, they have to really like, they have to be confrontational. They have to be constructive about it and supportive of one another. So we built the course around the lessons we learned. And when I became president of the local 3 years ago, the first step was sort of reconfiguring our executive. So it was a big push to get more allies on the executive. So we formed a majority. Once we had the majority, we reorganized the budget to prioritize education spending. And then we ran, I think it was 10 to 12 back-to-back workflow organizing courses. Like it was like a huge investment. It was like over $50,000 for our local within like a span of a couple months, to just book people off work who had never been involved in a union educational before. And people were like, oh, you're just like, people are just going to take the book off. But we made it clear, right? Like we had application forms and questionnaires about like, why do you want to be involved? Making it very clear that you come to this course, it's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to be pressured to do public speaking. You're going to be pressured to do confrontational role plays. And that was like, by the end of it, it was over 300 members that had never been to an educational before, out of a 2,000 person local, 2,000 to 2,200 person local. And that created like our first sort of tier of new activists. And there was some job actions that resulted shortly after those courses as a result of the training, which was very inspirational. And we had so much momentum that other locals were looking at the work we were doing. Like Winnipeg, for example, we have a very close relationship with the Winnipeg local, looking at what we were doing, and they wanted to bring either myself or other people we trained to run the course. Because that was the other thing. The people running the course weren't the typical official CUPW facilitators. They were like people that had workflow activist experience, and we taught them how to teach the course, and then they taught other people how to teach the course. So our motto was then promoting to other locals, hey, we will teach you how to run the course. We will come and do it with you the first time. We'll train all your facilitators. We'll run the first course with you, and then you have the tools to do the same work in your local. So we had it lined up to go to Lethbridge, which is like a smallish town in Alberta, Calgary, Winnipeg. We were having talks with Vancouver. They were sort of on the fence because their executive was split on the matter of how to allocate funds, as is the case. And then the pandemic hit. So, it is what it is. Many of us are very sad at the missed opportunity, because we really believed that we were doing something unique nationally. And if we could have just got a foothold in other locals, because what ended up happening is our local kind of hit a wall as far as the kind of fights we could take on by ourselves. And we needed other locals to be able to join us in solidarity. And if we could have got some, like say Vancouver, Winnipeg, ourselves, and Calgary, like you don't need the whole country. You just need a few big locals. And then all of a sudden you have considerably more leverage. So I know that's a little bit long-winded way to answer the question of what about this course, but yeah, we're very proud of like the history that led to it. And then we're very proud of being able to provide that education opportunity. And I just spoke to the local Winnipeg president, Brother Matthew Aiken, and he was saying that his executive just had a conversation about how they're excited to have people from Edmonton come out in either May or June, pandemic allowing, of course, to get back to the process. So yeah, it's a very exciting time. It's too bad we've lost these 2 years, because it would have been incredible to see how far ahead we would be right now. But those lessons are still there. And when we could get back to our work floors not being as, because currently it's a big problem with the work floors the shifts are divided like 4 ways in a lot of stations. So whereas before you have most of the workers coming at the same time, now it's like split between 4 waves. And that creates a problem for work floor power because, if you have people split up between different waves, they're not coordinating amongst between themselves. There's not as many people on the floor at the same time to confront management. It's all these little challenges. And I can't do work floor visits, which was a key component of promoting these courses. Like I would show up and we would get 100 people out into a parking lot and talk about what the union's doing and why we need the help of the members, right?
And those are things just connected to the pandemic, those changes with the...
And ironically, they were a product of, we had a very strong work floor activist group that when the pandemic started, we issued demands immediately of, we want staggered shifts, we want cleaning kits. And Edmonton was one of the first locals in the country in CUPW to like implement these changes, and created sort of a template for other locals on how to, on like what sort of safety measures they should get. And it's long established since the beginning, but yeah.
What was the response from the national leadership of the union to this work being done at Edmonton?
It's a very difficult thing to answer because the political experience I come from, I kind of came up through the NDP youth provincially and nationally. I served as like the chair of the youth wing in Alberta. We were kind of like the left wing of the party, like the youth usually is, right? We were trying to push the party left. And so I'm used to these kind of political challenges of people having formed ideologies and that kind of shaping the way that policy goes, whether it's in a youth wing or informing policy for the party. And coming into CUPW, I was sort of expecting that same thing, but I haven't honestly seen it. I don't get the sense that our leadership has like a clear like ideological commitment or even like a clear plan. I just see it as a lot of sort of well-intentioned longtime activists that are just kind of naturally like no one else is stepping up, so they're the ones stepping up. And they're trying their best, but they don't have like the clear perspective of why we're losing and what we need to do to change that downward spiral. So as far as how does national see it, I used all the formal channels to reach out. Like I reached out to my regional office where we have our national director for Prairie Region who sits on the national executive board. And I would say like, look, can you present to the I asked first, I'm like, hey, could I present to the national board about what Edmonton's doing? To which I received the response, oh, we'll look into it. And then they got back to me. They're like, oh, no, we don't have guests. That's not precedent. So no, you can't, you're not on the NEB, so you can't be a guest. So I'd say like, okay, can you present on my behalf what we're doing? And then they would present it. And then it would just be like, oh, that's nice. And they would kind of task a couple people to have a phone call with me just to kind of, I don't know. It felt more like they were keeping tabs on what we were doing rather than looking for ways to help. And I'd send emails to the national president saying like, look, we have this program. Why can't we, like, this is inspiring stuff. As an example, our general membership meetings, we had a hard time getting quorum of like 20 people. And then we were having some meetings of over 120 people. Right. So it's like just on that alone. And then we recruited like almost 30 new stewards in my first year as president. So it's on those metrics alone, you'd think that would be grounds to be excited and to use us as an example. And then the response would be something along the lines of like, look, the national doesn't have any control over the locals. So the locals have to make their own decisions. And it's like, okay, fine. Just facilitate a conversation with our local and the other locals. Because when I would try and cold call Ontario or, Montreal, like a local in Ontario or say connecting with Montreal, the response I would get would be suspicion because it'd be like, why are you talking directly to me? You're supposed to be going through the proper channels. And I'm like, okay, well, we're talking now. What do you think? And it's just like, I don't know if I should be talking to you. So it's this weird regionalism, gatekeeping. I think people feel threatened. It's like, there's talk about like, oh, this kid is just running. And I'm like almost 40 years old. So it's kind of funny to be framed that way. But it's like, oh, is this kid running for national president or something? It's like, no, I don't have ambitions for that sort of thing. It's like, we just want to do the work because power doesn't come from the NEB. It comes from the locals. So how do we facilitate the locals getting powerful, right? And I think this is a a broader tactical consideration for like other unions as well. Like, I think the same dynamics exist everywhere, and they're probably worse in other unions that don't have as democratic a structure as CUPW. So yeah, we wouldn't get that support. I will say though, the education vice president at National, Dave Bleakney, was very excellent in offering like, okay, well, if you have under $1,000 expenditures, we could support you in that way. So basically, the idea was like, say I went out to Winnipeg to help facilitate the course, the Taking Back the Work Floor course, National could help subsidize that up to $1,000, which, we have a war chest of millions of dollars, right? So it's like, there's money to spend. And I mean, $1,000 compared to that seems a little bit like, oh, wow, you could be doing more, but whatever. We don't want to fight. We don't want to spend our energy fighting our own union. We just want to find the opportunities where we can to do the work that's necessary.
So then thinking about that and looking for opportunities to do the work, what led you to run for local president? And did you have any concerns about taking a full-time position?
Oh, yeah, absolutely concerned. And man, the stress harms me on a daily basis. But running for the position, to be quite honest, I was ready. Like, I was becoming very disenfranchised with CUPW. At that point, it'd been like, I think I just cleared 15 years as a member, and we had that big fight in 2011. I was really inspired by that, and I thought we could escalate that into further reforming the union, and it had the opposite effect. Like, people weren't willing to make like a group challenge against the local executive at the time, and as a result, the leadership just really kind of snuffed out the enthusiasm of the new group, and people just sort of went their separate ways. And I'm one of the only leading activists. Actually, I may be the only leading activist left from that 2011 push. So, that happened. Nothing really comes of it afterward. And you have a couple of disappointing regional conferences and national conventions where things don't change too much, except for one. On a bright note, Mike Palasek won the presidency. I believe it was 2016. I can't remember the dates exactly, but Brother Palasek's someone who I had the pleasure of having a close relationship. When I was like the Alberta NDP chair, he was the BC NDP chair, youth chair. And so we had strong left politics, and I wouldn't call us friends at the time, but we were definitely allies. And so he ended up in CUPW, ran on a very radical platform that was supported by Jean-Claude Perrault, one of our famous national presidents of the past. And, he came in like guns a-blazing about like trying to do all the things that a union needs to do, emphasizing like fighting unionism, grassroots power. But in my opinion, he was stifled by the National Executive Board at the time. He didn't have majority support, and they did a good job of sort of isolating him. And, that was a very dispiriting, like 2016 to, honestly, the dates are getting mixed up for me, but that span of 4 years were really disheartening because a lot of people had high hopes, and nothing really came of it, not because of the lack of the effort on the brothers' part, just because there wasn't the political support at the national level. Also a cautionary tale about front-loading your politics to be leadership-centric, right? That's not Mike's fault. Mike did the best with what he could. It was just a complete gap for the rest of the union as far as developed work floor activists and leaders at different levels. So nothing came of that. So I was ready to leave CUPW. I'd received a lot of sort of encouragement and offers from other labor unions to apply for jobs with them. And honestly, the compensation is considerably greater than CUPW, like whether it's your letter carrier or if you become a full-time officer. But the dilemma for me was like, okay, well, I believe CUPW is one of the few unions left in the country that has that like social movement grassroots structure that can be changed. Like, or not, you don't want to change the structure, but the structure allows for like meaningful changes within the union. You don't just get stifled by the bureaucracy, although that's still possible if you don't have the right numbers. So I really believe CUPW is one of the last vehicles for radically overhauling the Canadian labor movement, and leaving CUPW would be effectively giving up on like that part of the struggle. And it would be me sort of signaling that, okay, well, I could still do good work that helps people, but I would be giving up on those big idea, like reform, like trying to reform the labor movement, right? So I wasn't ready to give up on that. And I felt kind of bad about not kind of taking on more of a leadership role. People had been kind of pushing me for a while at the local level. It's like, why don't you become a president? And in truth, I had a lot of anxiety around public speaking. And so I was very reluctant to face that. And it was through that work floor activism and like through training, like just grinding it out, that I'm still nervous about it, but you have enough confidence to get through it. And it was just kind of like, all right, this is my last shot. I'm going to run for president. And I was very clear to the local. I was like, dude, please do not vote for me unless you are committed to a radical work floor organizing strategy. Like, that's the only way I want to do it. And if I get elected, if we're not able to run these courses and have this kind of support from the members within the first year, I'll resign. So it was like I ran conditionally and received like overwhelming support in that vote. I believe it was at least a 2/3 majority against like a more establishment candidate, like another, a good true believer, longtime shop steward sort of person, nothing wrong with them, but just really traditional ideas. And they tried to kind of do a little bit of scare tactic around like, oh, Roland's just going to get us into trouble. And it's like, you know what? Trouble's good as long as we have the right training and we're all willing to support each other. We're not inoculated against the consequences. Like, this is how change is made. Members responded positively, and the first year of my first term was like I feel so good about the work we did and like all the new people that came on board. And our executive is made up of almost entirely new activists, and that transitioned into the beginning of the pandemic, which we did a really good job, like threatening mass work refusals in order to get those like protections in place early. And but then since then, I had my reelection partway through the pandemic, and it was kind of like, all right, this is going to end eventually. I'll stick around because we could get back to doing the work. But to answer your question about concerns about full-time office, I was absolutely concerned. I know of, you could have all the best intentions in the world, but you get into that role and the bureaucratic pressure to just like, oh, you got to do 20 consults within this month. You got to do this many meetings with management. Sometimes you spend more time with management than you do with your own members. And I call it the drift, when people will be tempted to have, in order to have change, they'll foster friendly relationships. They're not friends with management, but they'll foster friendly relations with management because it's easier to ask management for a favor than it is to try and get like a group of workers to pressure them, right? So it was very disorienting for management when I came into office, because I cut off labor relations meetings because I was like, you're not listening to us. Like, you aren't giving us anything. You're just using it as an opportunity to try and blame us for whatever policies that you're implementing. So we're not having these meetings again with you until like you start actually playing ball. And it's been 3 years, like almost on a monthly basis. They're like, hey, when can we have the meetings? We're like, no. And then they'll call our regional office and be like, oh, they're hurting their own members by not having a meeting with us. And then our regional office will be like, just have a meeting with them. We'll be like, no. So it's funny because it has resulted in them like changing their policies at the local level. But the way that I kind of push back against the pressures of like the bureaucratic drift was when the pandemic wasn't happening, had a very aggressive work floor visit regime. So it would be like in that first year, it was something like, no exaggeration, like over 250 work floor visits. So my day would be split by, I would go to one work location in the morning, visit with all the different shifts, and then I would go to the office and finish whatever bureaucratic administrative crap I had to do. And all those meetings were very like those meetings didn't happen in the local, or if they did, they would happen maybe once a year. So people were just like getting into the habit of having like a monthly work floor at least a monthly work floor meeting where someone from the union was saying like, here's what's happening at GMMs. Here's courses that you could apply for. Here's a job action that happened at another station. Are you aware of it? Are you signed up? Like, we built our communication apparatus. We didn't really have a website, and our listserv had maybe like 400 people out of our 2,200. So we built that up to over 2,000 members are on our listserv. We built a website, and those are just like simple things that, especially for a mostly volunteer-based organization like ours, to communicate with our members, it was like a huge step. And as a result, tons of people wanting to get involved. And all of that is important for when people take on these full-time roles, because the tendency is always to take everything on yourself, to hoard influence and leadership. And you need to be very deliberate in sharing influence and power. And the more people you get involved, the easier it is to do that.
And when you ran, did you have like-minded people running with you?
One brother, was it the same? Yeah, the brother ran as at the time it was the organizing officer position. So there was only 4 positions up at that time. And so I had one close ally run with me. The previous president had ran for a chief steward position. We had good relations at the time, but I wouldn't have called us allies. But they weren't standing in the way of the work. They weren't going to stand in the way of the work we're doing, but they weren't exactly going to enthusiastically pound the drum with us. So yeah, at that time it was just kind of like going in on my own, and it took like a few months. It took like a little bit into the first term to kind of feel out the rest of the executive and to make it clear that with a new direction we really pressured people to, it's like, hey, you have a portfolio, you actually have to do the work. And so there was some people on the executive that had been used to just holding positions as like as a resume builder or, a point of prestige. And when you started kind of nudging them at exec meetings about like, hey, how come this isn't being done, right? And then that kind of pressure led to them just resigning. And the people that stepped in were people that we'd kind of brought up through the various activist courses. And then slowly it became like a solid majority. And now we have complete consensus, honestly. Like everyone is like on our 10-person executive, everyone is on board.
How are things right now in terms of workplace organizing in the pandemic conditions and so on?
It's snuffed out. Like morale is just so low, especially in the beginning when there was all that fear around what is COVID and how will it affect us. So that fear sort of channeled into our mass work refusal threats, and to establishing like the different the staggered starts, like splitting up the shifts, staggering when people come into the workplace, staggering the breaks so that you don't have overlap between the shifts. So once that was sort of put in place, it became like the work floor visits stopped. We couldn't do the educationals anymore because we weren't allowed to have that many people in the same room. We tried to adapt our training to online, and it didn't work. Like when you're trying to train people on how to confront power and how scary that is, it doesn't work to do it over Zoom. You need to have the physicality of people in the room and like feeling that discomfort and being like pushed out of their comfort zone to do it. So the courses stopped. The work floors were split up because of the different shifts. No work floor meetings. And yeah, it's just the morale wasn't there, and it was hard to get enough people to have that sense of confidence to challenge management on issues. And at the same time, management was kind of hunkered down a bit too. There wasn't as many issues coming up of them being like cutesy about, just like taking liberties where they might have in the past. Like they're always jerks, right? But no, there weren't that many issues that came up where people would feel agitated enough beyond the pandemic to want to take on that fight. So it has been a demoralizing time, and it's rough from my position, because most of my monthly reports and our weekly updates are mostly reiterating the same point of like, hey, just don't lose sight of the plan. Like the plan is there, and we'll get back to the plan eventually. And in the meantime, we're here to help you in the office. But yeah, work floor activism we haven't solved that puzzle on how to do that effectively during a pandemic.
And over the last number of years, then what do you think successfully changed in the local as an organization that you haven't mentioned yet? And maybe are there things that haven't changed that you think still need to change in terms of how the local functions as an organization?
I think for our local, we've really established a culture of organizing. So now when, example, we present a budget or present like an organizing course we want to run, whereas in the past, you would always anticipate a fight. Now, like our general membership meetings are mostly made up of people that went through these courses, right? Like these are people that have now been inspired to get involved in the union. So it's like there's a solid majority of people in solid majority of active union members in this local that believe in the plan, the workflow organizing plan. And as a result, it's keeping things on the rails. Like there are like some old guard aspects to the local, like older, not age-wise, but just like previous kind of leadership elements within the local that are definitely like looking for moments of weakness in our group and like try and take shots where they can. Famously, one of the previous exec members thought that they would make hay by trying to present a motion that would lower dues, just so some financial relief for members. And they really tried to make it this like almost right-wing populist issue of just like, hey, our dues are the highest in the country, which they are. We pay $10 extra on top of our regular dues amount. They're like, our dues are the highest in the country, and that's not fair. And you should have some financial relief. And we have this motion to reduce your dues by like $10 a month or whatever it is, right? And so they really tried to like this was right at the beginning, within like I think the first 4 months of my presidency, and they were really just trying to take us down a peg. And so we just mobilized, and that was I think we had almost 140 people at that meeting. People were spilling out of the bay doors of our union hall. And when I remember very distinctly speaking on that motion and just saying like, this is just, yeah, okay, we're spending a little bit extra money, but this is the value we're giving the membership. And if you take away this extra money, it's like no more educational courses, right? Less shop stewards. We might have to cut a full-time officer position. And like, this is just bad. This is just bad from the perspective of, it's like, if you want the union to be powerful, you want to fund it, you want to resource it. So it's like, we need to not only vote down this motion, but we need to obliterate this motion. And then the vote ended up being only 3 people voted in favor of it. So like it sent a strong message to that contingent, and they haven't been the same since, honestly, right? Like, so yeah, as far as where our local's at, we firmly established that it's a strong left-wing culture in the local. All of our leadership are firmly, like, they believe in the plan. Our secondary leadership is on board, believes in the plan, and we are all just chomping at the bit for the pandemic to end, to get back to that inspiring work, because we feel that's going to be the thing that is going to positively impact CUPW. We feel that if we could start building those relationships with other locals, it'll be the locals leading the direction of the union. And at a certain point, the NEB will be compelled to support our direction, right? It's, I don't think they're so much ideologically opposed to what we're doing. They're just frightened and don't know how to see it through. And when you're in the office and you're that divorced from the membership for that long, I think you lose sight of the collective power of the membership. So for us, it's like, if we could just build up people's confidence and capacity and get that momentum going, it's anything's possible, really. And as far as anything that needs to change in the local, the saying of CUPW is the struggle continues. So with us, it's like, if we take our foot off the gas at any point, like outside of the context of the pandemic, it's like, absolutely, those old guard tendencies will try and get back in there. So you just got to be persistent. You can't ever stop with communicating with the members, offering these education opportunities, supporting the work floor. So when they're upset about something, it's just like letting them know that they're the leaders in challenging a problem. And as long as you do that, you're going to be successful. And I think that's kind of maybe a broader takeaway for the rest of the labor movement, is that I would say a lot of unions have stopped trusting their memberships, or at least being a little bit wary of what their membership's going to do. And that's a mistake, because we don't have any formal power with arbitration or grievances, right? We're just relying on like basically technicalities and getting lucky. And if we get legislated back to work, doesn't matter how many court challenges we do, right? It's like, we're going to be disappointed. So if the only way out of this problem is building that grassroots power, you can't do that. Can't do that on a technical basis. You can't do that on filing a grievance. It needs to be a willingness to trust the members and empower the members.
Do you have any other thoughts on what the lessons of your experience are for activists in other workplaces that are really different than Canada Post, and in unions that are really different than CUPW?
Oh, I think there's like an interesting kind of, I think there's always a tendency to talk about unions in these romantic terms. Like example, like talking about like we need to organize Amazon, which we absolutely, like someone needs to successfully organize Amazon. But the sort of idea of you finally get to organize Amazon and then the problem goes away. It's just like, well, anyone who's been involved in a union knows that it brings with it its own politics, right? Like I like to, when I'm talking to newer members about the dynamics of a union, I'll explain a union's like a provincial legislature, right? It's not just a monolithic body with the same ideas. They're different groups with different notions about how things should be done. And sometimes that the established notion within that union is hostile to, say, membership involvement, right? Like the leadership does not want to give up influence or power. They don't want to let the members run the ship, so to speak. And again, that's just very dangerous because you could have the smartest, best intentioned leadership in the world, but they aren't the power of the union. And if they're willingly kind of restraining the power of the members, you're eventually going to hit that wall of a union becoming ineffectual, which I would argue pretty much every union in Canada is ineffectual on those grounds. And I think, you didn't ask me to do this, but just to say, it's like your book, Canadian Labor in Crisis, does an excellent job of sort of detailing like the different structures of unions and gives examples of how certain unions are more effective than others. So it's, I encourage any listeners to check out that book. And it's a great conversation to have with other unionists. And with CUPW, I think our window is closing to really get back to what made us powerful. And the reason I say that is because Amazon is eating our lunch. The only profitable parts of Canada Post business are parcels and ad mail. And we're only delivering ad mail if we're kind of still going throughout the neighborhood and delivering parcels and letters, right? But if our parcel volume goes down, it's, Canada Post is going to be looking aggressively to shave routes because it doesn't make sense for us to be going door to door anymore. And Amazon's the big reason we're going to lose our parcel volume. It's like this year, it was considerably less volume than previous years. And it's because in Edmonton, and I'm sure there's experience is similar throughout the country. In Edmonton, this is the first year we saw the fleet of Amazon vans show up. Because previously what Amazon did was they would use our infrastructure to process product. So they would have things shipped, like they would have their inventory warehouses that would receive product. And for final mile delivery, they would send it to Canada Post. And Canada Post had special arrangements. And it's pretty interesting because essentially Amazon would be coming to Canada Post with a gun to Canada Post's head and say like, hey, we got an offer you can't refuse, deliver our parcels for us. And Canada Post needs to take it because they need the money. And then knowing full well that as Amazon is delivering, they're building up their own infrastructure. And when the time comes, they pull their product from us, and then they have their own delivery fleets. So as that process keeps deepening, Canada Post has nothing left to stand on. And then we become a tax burden. Right now, we're not a tax burden to Canadians. We give back to Canadian revenues. But if that changes, the political climate changes, right? And so, one of the bigger fights within the union is the question of how aggressively do we pursue postal banking as like a means to not only provide an important public service to Canadians, but as a way of subsidizing our operations to stay competitive. And so I'm of the opinion that it's like our union maybe has 4 to 6 years to develop like a militant strategy to defy back to work legislation. Our union keeps getting back, this is a warning from the future for other unions. It's like you think you've figured out the game in arbitration. Well, the government's just going to legislate you back to work. And it doesn't matter if you're an essential service. It doesn't matter if it's fair. It doesn't matter what labor law says. They will do this because they know we will not push back. And CUPW has been a case study in being legislated back to work, since 87. I don't know. I want to say 7 or 8 times. Like just ridiculous, right? And then no pushback. And it's really, unless we develop a strategy to basically say we're willing to defy back to work legislation to institute public postal banking, I think that's going to be the end of CUPW as like an effective organization within a decade. So it's there's a lot of possibility for us to make a lot of ground. Like if we win something like that and face down the government on that issue, I think it signals to the rest of the labor movement what else is possible. And CUPW can once again be Like we're small, but we're mighty. And it's like, we can be that leading example. But if we think that we could just keep applying the same strategies unsuccessfully to confront these problems that we know are inevitably going to hit us the same way, we're going to be very disappointed, and our members are going to suffer as a result.
And it's interesting because I think although the challenges facing other unions are going to be quite different than the specific things that you face at Canada Post with Amazon and so on, there's a broader lesson about unions that, some are clearly doing things that don't work in a catastrophically bad way. Others are doing things that help them get by, moderately well or not as badly, but that simply clinging to these existing routines in a changing capitalist society is going to be disastrous.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thinking broadly, then, you obviously put a lot of effort into the workplace, building power. And I think that's really important in a situation where so many unions have just vacated the workplace, right, in favor of the grievance and arbitration procedure and so on. So much so that the idea that you might even have a workplace strategy is just not there, right? Well, what would that mean, right? It's nobody's ever experienced it. Mm-hmm. But thinking that what the relationship is between building power in the workplace and building the power of workers more broadly in society, right? Not just to struggle against management, but because the things that we experience, the problems that we're up against are more broadly about capitalism, not just in the workplace. Do you have any thoughts about the relationship there between the things that we do in the workplace, workplace organizing, and trying to build class power in society?
Oh, it's indispensable. Like it's such a beautiful thing when you have people that maybe didn't think, like they would say, oh, I'm not political, or, they don't vote, or they don't pay attention to politics. And then because they're pissed off about something happening in the workplace, they could be inspired to take like a workflow organizing course. And then in that course, they meet other people. They're like, hey, you feel the same way I do. Holy shit. And then they go back to the workplace and they're like, hey, you know what? This manager is pissing me off. And now I know what to do about it. And now I know I have a group of people that are going to support me. And it's like in those moments is when you develop your class consciousness, because it's like you understand that, the manager, you can be friendly with them. Like you can understand as a human being, it's like, oh, I don't mind this person. But you understand that like in the workplace, their interests are not your interests, and they're working to undermine you. So when you understand that, and then you take further steps to improve your own situation as a worker with a bunch of people supporting you, it forces, as you know, that contradiction. Because manager, no matter how chummy you are, you might talk about the Oilers or the Jets on a daily basis, but then you're saying like, well, what the hell? You're making us go out in this icy weather without like proper safety equipment. And then that person just being like, hey, look, my boss is telling me I have to tell you to do this. So, I'm not going to risk my job in going easy on you. It's like, you got to do this. And it's like, hey man, I thought we were buddies. We talked about the game. It's just like, no, you got to do this, or I'm going to discipline you. And then it's just like, oh, and that's just one step down the road of like a worker recognizing themselves like as a worker in a political sense. It's like, oh, okay, I need to stand up for myself, and learning that you can't do that successfully on your own. And I do believe that with enough repetitions of those experiences, and say the struggles escalate, say it starts with like maybe a small work refusal in one station and goes to like a citywide refusal of forced overtime, and then it goes to like a pushback by multiple locals against like a certain work method, right? And maybe doing like a work to rule campaign. And then as those things escalate, a person's relationship with those politics deepens to the point where I do believe they're taking that home with them. It's like, the next time they have a holiday dinner, someone's like, hey, what's going on at work? Whereas previously the conversation might have been like, God, the grind, right? We all talk about the grind, or as I was always kind of tongue in cheek say on my letter carrier route, when a customer would ask me, hey, how's your day? And I'd be like, oh, living the dream, right? So it's like, whereas previously it might be that sort of conversation, it might be someone with their eyes lit up talking about, holy crap, me and my whole station face down this bully boss, right? And then like the person having pride about that, and then having a sense of purpose that they might not have felt in other ways in their life, right? And then that maybe informing them like the next time an election comes up where it's just like they could look at all the parties and be like, oh, look at all these grifters, and like having a more refined sense of looking at the issues at hand. And the next time someone comes through their workplace with like an offer to like take a course, or the next time they're like, say, out in the community and there's like an anti-war rally or a Black Lives Matter rally, all of a sudden these issues of justice become more poignant for them. So what starts in the workplace, and it's a great way of building bridges too, right? Because a workplace is a very diverse place with people from all different ethnicities and belief systems. And those class interests really unite people. They really do. So it's like that super, and I think in psychology, they call it like a superordinate goal, where people can identify that, oh, it's like we have our differences, but this is the big thing that unifies us. So it's like, it's a balm for what is an otherwise, I would say, a pretty, sick society, even outside of the pandemic, right? So it's like, there's a lot of division in society. A lot of people feel powerless and frustrated. It's like, what do we do? And I believe the union, is an indispensable model as far as like, here is a power structure that posits something different, posits something, what is possible. And I believe that there has been a substantial corrosion over the last almost 100 years of what's possible for a union. And, but the structure is still there, so that if people are deliberate in how they engage it and how they want to change it, that it can be turned back into the structure that can provide those opportunities for change, not only within the workplace, but within broader society. Because if these unions are successful in changing their workplace, those stories get out. And then they become, like, example, like if our local keeps developing the way that it has, like I had one idea that I'd love to turn our union hall into more of a community center, and like could offer our space and some of our expertise as trainers into helping community groups popping up that maybe, it's like people want to organize their workplace, and they just want some basic training on how to do that. It's like we're not well-resourced and best position to take on that organizing drive for them, but we could give them some tools on how to properly map their work floors and have those conversations, right? So there's tremendous opportunity there. And in the past, unions, I think, did establish themselves as more parts of the community. They would have like sports leagues or community centers and just like more prominent in the community. And I think as we gain strength and people are inspired to see us in that way, we could get back to that role.
And I think once I don't in any way disagree with the importance of the workplace organizing and the way that the experience of collective struggle against management can, do all the things that you're talking about. I think it then poses interesting questions about, because there's limits to the consciousness that gets forwarded from people who are just thinking about taking on their employer, right? And to think about the challenge of how that can be built on to have a broad class understanding, right? Because I'm sure you've encountered people who are very militant against Canada Post, but have very contradictory ideas.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And like, actually one point I missed is that, it's so, yeah, like Alberta, obviously a lot of right-wing people with some pretty reactionary ideas, if I'm being charitable about it. And it could be very tricky, right? Like they would be maybe anti-union in principle. Like I had an experience with a brother out of my old workstation who were just like, was always very anti-union. And then it came to this issue of they were upset about, it was some issue around like delivering ad mail. And, it was just a matter of they had to put in some more effort to make sure that this ad mail was delivered. And it just I didn't think this would be the issue that would get people fired up. But sure enough, we had like 120 out of 160 carriers that were just like, I'm not delivering this piece of crap. Like, I'm just not doing it. And me being like, all right, well, and talking with other activists, they're just being like, well, is this the issue people are going to risk suspension over? And people are like, yes. And I'm like, okay, well, you got to go with the group, right? And so this member who was very right-wing, very anti-union, had no trouble like shouting me down every time I would try and talk to him. But when he needed something, and then we were, my chair's stuck. He needed something, and we were there for him. And then that brought him on board, and he's since become quite, he's warming up to the organization, right? And I think those sort of opportunities are important. And, all that we can do is patiently explain and offer the opportunities, right? So it's as leaders within the struggle, we say it's like, look, here's how you fight the boss. Here's tools to fight the boss. And you say it 100 times and people maybe latch onto it, 5 or 6 times. But once they do, it's like you have their ear, and then you just keep building on that good work. And so when these broader political problems happen, like whether it's a provincial election or say, like the issues around police brutality, you also have a leadership that's framing that discussion. So whereas before it wasn't talked about, you now have a group of people that are willing to say, it's like, hey, look, here's an example. Like when we're saying defund the police, here's why it's relevant to the struggle we've been conducting this whole time. And it really it challenges people in a constructive way, right? They're just like, why is my union talking about this? And we say, here's why we're talking about this. Here's the issue of state power. And then, and because they respect us, we have a better opportunity to convey a message than just, a union that doesn't do any of that work, that essentially is just signaling those intentions without having the trust of their members, right?
Yeah, and it's of course a challenge for people who are trying to provide left leadership in unions that's really grounded in workplace power in a situation where there's almost no socialist forces organized in this country outside the workplace. And so this takes me to the last question. I mean, fortunately, there is more, talk about socialism in some way happening, right? Less so in Canada than in the US, for example. There are lots of things we could say that are critical about the way people are thinking about it, but capitalism is giving lots of reasons to people to question it. Mm-hmm. And there are more people now identifying as socialists or anti-capitalists. But for a lot of those people today, I think clear majority of them, workplace organizing has really no place in their politics. Mm-hmm. People are becoming socialists or anti-capitalists, but either there's no place for workplace organizing, or it's just really abstract because they have no experience of it. Mm. Even if they're union members, they've probably not experienced much workplace power. They probably got much more experience with just grievance and arbitration plus political action, usually meaning just the NDP. And as you say, even when people are more on the left, if they haven't actually built credibility by making the union a way that workers themselves take on their problems in the workplace, then it's going to seem very detached. So do you have any thoughts about these kinds of issues, like speaking to people who are listening to this podcast who would be socialists but really don't have any experience in workplace organizing themselves, and what the importance of workplace organizing is for socialist and anti-capitalist politics?
David, I think you nailed it when you said they just don't have the experience of it, and I think that's just why it's not relevant. It's simply that, like, if unions say this was like the 1930s and unions are being more effective in the struggle and representing a different possibility in society, people will look at that as a legitimate form of struggle and want to be involved in it. Everyone wants to be on the winning team. Like, I'm sure you have this experience in Winnipeg with the Jets, and the same thing in the Oilers. It's like, if the Oilers make the playoffs, everyone's an Oilers fan. But if they're not making the playoffs, it's a little bit harder to find the true believers, even in a hockey mind-sick city like Edmonton. But it's, everyone wants to be on the winning team, and Labor is not the winning team. Labor, whether it's CUPW or really any other union in the country, there's not a lot of positive, inspiring examples. And if there have been struggles that have been won, I'd say they mostly won on the grounds of like an arbitration surprisingly going their way, as opposed to like mass mobilization. Like I can't think of an example other than like the last big example I could think of is the early 1980s, when it's like CUPW defied back to work legislation, and that eventually led to maternity leave being granted in Canada, right? It's like, I'm having a hard time. I believe there was like the nurses in Saskatchewan also defied legislation to win a pretty impressive contract in the early 90s.
They got legislated back to work in 99.
Oh, okay.
In Saskatchewan.
Maybe something earlier than that. I have a vague memory of it. Should have read up on it first. My fault. But the idea being, like, there isn't a lot of inspiring examples. And as a result, people maybe look at the labor movement and unions as kind of like this kind of old way of doing things. And in some ways, I feel like, despite being relatively young in terms of labor leadership, like 40 years old, I'm young as a leader within labor. And that's saying something right there. But I do feel like this kind of holdover from a different time, right? Like it's just like the work we're doing just doesn't really exist in the same way. The strongest analogy that I could come to is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Farrell Dobbs and his work. Like, yeah, so 1934, like his work with the Teamsters, it's like it was by no means by design that our local pursued this, but I ended up finding out about Dobbs and their work with the Teamsters. And it's like, it's shocking how similar it is to, like obviously their scale is much greater and they're much more successful, but like the same sort of political dynamics of like having to go up against your own union leadership and trying to inspire your own members at the same time. It's like, if that's the most analogous example I could think of, and that's from 1934, it's like, yeah, we don't have a lot of things to hopefully sell to the new generation. So, or at least people getting involved in politics. So to your question of what do we tell them? It's like, I don't think we could tell them anything that's convincing. I think the best thing we can do is provide inspiring examples. So if there are people within unions that are embarking on this sort of work, whether it's like the labor notes people pushing for left militancy in different unions in the States, even like, although I think the consulting model of labor activism isn't the ultimate road, like the Jane McElvey approach, it's like, at this point, we'll take all the help we can get. It's like what she's offering is further ahead than a lot of what most unions are offering. So whatever, like just if a union's going to come to it that way, I just want them there somehow. Like that's where we're at. We're desperate. And if we can string together some wins, then you're going to see the people looking at this model as being an effective model. So say you have a successful organizing drive in the States with Amazon, and say the Amazon union doesn't end up being just like the worst aspect of unionism. There might be a glimmer of hope there. There's a huge reform push for, I believe, the Teamsters in the States right now. So there's like an opportunity there to, if you develop a real grassroots leadership of a union, and as a result, you get mass mobilization that's successful. Those stories will recruit on their own. I think that's what's necessary. But as far as like me trying to sell something to a member or to another person considering politics, it's like, unless you're willing to kind of, and I wouldn't advise it, taking sort of like the route I took to politics of being like, hey, I'm a teenager that wants to be, pushing for radical reform within the labor movement. And I'm just going to join Canada Post, get involved in the union and just see where it takes me. It's like, I mean, there's a lot of disappointments and a lot that could go wrong. So unless you really have a clear view of sticking it out for 20 years or more, then yeah, that's a lonely road. So I guess we just, hopefully the people in the unions are getting fed up with losing. They start changing their politics, or maybe CUPW provides that spark, which would inspire other unions to, consider changing as well. But once that change comes, and it inevitably will, people will be thrilled to take up the banner once again, I think.
Thank you, Roland. And I'll put a link in the show notes to Farrell Dobbs' book, Teamster Rebellion, which is an excellent read for anybody looking to read about class struggle in the 1930s and the role of socialists in one particular place in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
So thanks for covering all this. It's been super. And maybe we'll wrap it here.
Yeah, thanks so much, David.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.